Yes, we are live on Facebook.
Hi, everybody. It's night 2 of the Progressive Candidate Summit, and I want to welcome you. I don't know if you were here with us last night. We talked to J.D. Scholten, who's running for Congress in Iowa. And for those of you who are watching, there is a follow-up to that. Steve King was defeated in his Republican primary. That's good news. And at the same time, that doesn't mean our work is over because somebody who is every bit as conservative as Steve King will now be the Republican opponent of J.D. Scholten. So I hope once again you'll go to Scholten, Scholten for Congress. Check out that race. I hope that you will make that part of your conversation with yourself and your friends as one of the progressives that you want to support. It's so important that the Democrats hold on to the House of Representatives, and that would be actually adding a seat. Tonight's candidate is every bit as exciting. It's a very big deal. Tonight, I want to introduce you to Andrew Romanoff. Now, this is a Senate race, and Andrew is running against former governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper. Now, let me give you a little bit of a context for this before I introduce you to our esteemed guest and why and let you know why I feel so strongly about this. You know, everybody talks about a blue wave and, you know, people will say things like, I just want to vote for the Democrat. It's not that simple. There are shades of blue. There's blue and then there's blue. The issue in America really isn't so much left-right as it is corporatist versus democratic. And I mean democratic in the sense of democracy. So what has happened in the last 40 years is there's been this major transfer, not only of wealth, but also of political power into the hands of corporate interests. And these corporate interests are health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies and agricultural conglomerates, which we were talking about a lot last night in terms of Iowa, has to do with gun manufacturers, food companies, oil and gas companies, defense contractors, etc. Now, the Republican Party is very much a corporatist party. They have almost for hook, line, and sinker bought into this corporatist mentality. And they have their own, you know, the Republicans have to fight for the soul of the Republican Party, and I hope that they will. In the Democratic Party, we also have that split, however. In the Democratic Party, there are the real progressives, such as the ones you're meeting on this summit, including Andrew Romanoff, you'll meet tonight, but also the corporatists. And the corporatist group of the Democratic Party pretty much tries to have it both ways. So what you have is the Republican Party that's really taking a stand for all this corporate power and arguing that that's best for the American people and best for the American economy. And then you have the Democratic Party, which is in this weird place where they are beholden to all these corporate donors. There are a lot of elite establishment Democrats who basically are aligned with a corporatist mentality, and yet they recognize there's a lot of suffering that emerges. So they wring their hands a lot and they try to pass laws that ameliorate the suffering. That's not enough. What the progressive vision is to challenge the underlying forces that make all that suffering inevitable. Now, that's a big difference. And what is happening now is that you have a Democratic establishment that is very much an elite establishment, I must say, and it is very much in the corporatist camp. And we shouldn't kid ourselves. They work hard, and they have been for years, pushing out the real progressives from the kind of power positions that they should have. Thus, we get to our guest tonight. There is a Republican senator in Colorado named Cory Gardner. All the polls show he's got to go. The Democrat's going to win. The issue is, which Democrat will it be? The corporatist candidate, a nice man named John Hickenlooper, and the progressive candidate, also a nice man named Andrew Romanoff. Andrew, thank you for being here. I'm glad you're here, and I'm very excited actually to introduce you to the people in the Progressive Summit.
Thank you so much for having me, Marianne. It's a pleasure to meet you, at least virtually here, and you diagnosed the dynamics in this race spot on.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I was going to ask you how'd I do. So listen, Andrew, I have seen your bio. I know about your extraordinary work in the past. I know that you were the Speaker of the House in Colorado. I know that you have worked a lot with mental health in Colorado, that you've actually walked your talk on such levels during even the Civil War in Nicaragua. I know that you have worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center, but no one can tell the story of your past and what brought you to this point better than you. So it's a fascinating biography. Let people know a little bit about your past.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for your leadership. It really means a lot to me that you're willing to have so many of us down ballot candidates on for these conversations, because, as you know, flipping the Senate is arguably at least as important as replacing the president.
No matter who wins in November, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. Either way, we should talk about that if you'd like. I credit my involvement in public service, my commitment to social justice, to my family, my grandpa and my grandma who worked with a group called Project Hope, bringing medical supplies around the world, and particularly to my mother, who was a social worker. She worked at a state mental hospital before the institution itself was dismantled during that wave of deinstitutionalization. So my mom came home with stories of the people she was trying to help on the streets, folks who were living under bridges or on benches in parks. Folks had been kicked to the curb. Some of them ended up, by the way, in my dad's courtroom, where he was a judge. I have thought about this ever since. I wondered how many of the defendants my dad sentenced might have started out in my mom's mental hospital. And more than that, I wondered what kind of a country condemns people with brain diseases to a life like that, or sends them to an early grave. And can a country like that, a country like ours, call itself civilized?
That's right.
So that was, for me at least, one of the early inspirations for my commitment to public service. As you mentioned, I took a job at the Southern Poverty Law Center. I moved to Montgomery, Alabama to join the fight against the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups right after I turned 21. I did not expect to be having the same fight 30 years later, or to find a president of the United States on the other side, somebody who would posit this absurd notion that there are good people on both sides of that debate. I've been thinking a lot about that experience too, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about the movement for racial justice. Yeah, in some ways it was easier to see the racism when it wore a hood and burned a cross on your lawn. I ran for the State House, and happy to talk about the work that I've done in public office too.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask you about. You obviously are committed to social justice work. You recognize that mental health issues is a social justice issue. Working against Nazis, the Southern Poverty Law Center, et cetera. But I'm curious, what made the shift, the transition for you from working in those non-governmental organizations and nonprofit type of sphere to actually wanting to run for office?
Well, I ran for the State House, and I'm running for the Senate for that matter, because I don't want anybody to struggle or suffer or die on account of problems that we can fix. I don't think anybody believes that government is necessarily the solution to every problem, but there are some things that we can do together, like fight a fire or teach a child or pave a pothole, things we can't do as well or as easily on our own. And to me, that's the justification for government itself. I was proud to lead the Democrats in Colorado to our first majority in 30 years. Our first back-to-back majorities actually since 1960. That's how I became Speaker of the House and got recognized as the best legislative leader in America. I figured politics doesn't reward modesty, so I want to make sure to work that into the conversation.
And that's not what you're supposed to be doing here tonight. So let's get real about what's happened here. You were the Speaker of the House of Colorado. You took it to the first Democratic majority. So why does the Democratic senatorial leadership led by Chuck Schumer, why do they not want you to be the candidate, Andrew?
Well, there's a couple of schools of thought here. Some folks take the view that you got to pick the guy with the most money because he's the only one who can win. Even John Hickenlooper himself doesn't believe that. He told audiences last year, not only did he say he'd be a terrible senator and would hate the job and wasn't cut out for it. I believe him. He also said that we didn't need him to beat Cory Gardner. And he's right. We don't. Gardner's approval rating, you hinted at this earlier, is down to 34%. He loses to even a generic Democrat by double digits. Now, I happen to believe we need more than a generic Democrat in this job.
Okay, slow down a little bit here because I want everybody to really follow the process. Hickenlooper said, I don't know if he said he didn't want the job. He said he wouldn't be good at it. He said that he wasn't needed. So what happened to make the Democratic establishment want to put in Hickenlooper? Because the answer to that question is a big part of what's happening in this country.
Yeah, you're right. And he did say he not only did he say he didn't want the job, he said he would hate it and he'd be terrible at it. It's an odd way to begin a job interview. The national establishment, and you already know the answer to this because you've shared it with us earlier, but the Democratic establishment does not want somebody who's going to rock the boat. I had a
Okay,
chance.
let's talk about the boat that needs to be rocked. When you say, if you go in there, and there are two issues. One is strategy, and one is what the Democratic Party stands for. One, and you and I have discussed this, the idea that many of the Democratic establishment have, that the way to win is to go centrist, to go Republican light. But the other has to do with the fact that even if you win, that's not what they want. What is it that you represent that is so counter to the establishment that it would excite us and turn them off?
Well, I represent a challenge to the status quo. I support bold, aggressive action to combat the climate crisis, a universal single-payer healthcare system, an economy that works for all of us. It's a threat not just to the country club that the Senate cloakroom has become. It's also a threat, frankly, to their corporate donors. I mean, the same folks you mentioned earlier, the drug companies, the insurance companies, the fossil fuel companies, the big agricultural conglomerates. I mean, they don't want the Democratic establishment doesn't want somebody that's going to bite the hand that's feeding them. And look, to be perfectly blunt, I don't care. I'm not running to do the bidding of the party bosses or the power brokers in Washington. I think we need a senator for the rest of us.
That's right. I was telling a story last night. I'm here in Washington, D.C. All these big, beautiful buildings, which obviously represent a lot of power, lawyers, lobbyists, all kinds of people. And I said to my friend, well, who here is to represent the people? And she said, the non-governmental organizations, nonprofits. And I said, well, that's what the senators and the Congress people in the White House should be. Now, this is a perfect time. So everybody, you've been listening to why it is that the progressives, why are the progressives different than the corporatists, even within the Democratic Party? Why the Democratic Party establishment leans so often towards the corporatists because of the money that they have with which to run and also with which to please donors. So I hope that this gives you a real good reason why you yourself will now donate what you can. If this aligns with your thinking and you think, wow, what we need is not just Democratic senators, we need progressive Democratic senators, not just Democrats in the House, but progressives in the House, then I hope that you will do what you can. And remember, we talked about this last night. Don't think your $5 doesn't matter. No matter what it is, whether it's $5, $10, $50, $100, whatever is right. There's really, if everybody who is listening and who goes, yeah, I like this guy, sends in $5, it will serve Andrew. And the whole point here is the kind of corporate money that has such an undue influence, such an immoral influence on our political system is not going to support people like Andrew. So Andrew, where do they go, your website, in order to make that difference? What is your, is it andrewromanoff.com?
You got it. Yes, folks can go to andrewromanoff.com or andrewromanoff.com/yes if they want to chip in. You know, I brag a lot about the fact that we're not taking that corporate cash. We don't take money from special interest groups, but I should acknowledge they're not offering.
I was going to say, that's what I said. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. You know, people like you, Andrew, are not who they're so excited about getting it. It's
no,
power. It's people.
They've got other preferences. Both Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper take money from the fossil fuel industry, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the course of their career. And the problem is we get the bill because we're not going to get the bold climate action we need as long as the nation's biggest polluters continue to bankroll Congress and block reform. You don't have to do more than just follow the money.
Yeah.
Cory Gardner himself has taken more from the fossil fuel industry than I think all but one other member of Congress. And John Hickenlooper literally scratched his name off of the no fossil fuel money pledge when somebody explained that it meant he couldn't take that kind of cash.
Now, if I remember correctly, I don't want to get this wrong, John supports fracking, doesn't he?
He not only supports it, he sued communities that tried to restrict it and protect their public health. And he literally drank the fracking fluid. It's not a metaphor. It's just not a good idea. And it carries real consequences. I've met with folks in the fracking zone. I mean, families who have been devastated by the runaway oil and gas development that John presided over. We've seen an increase in birth defects among some of the families near those operations. And we've seen a record deterioration in air quality. Metro Denver now has some of the worst air quality in the country, not solely the product of oil and gas development, but we need to replace Cory Gardner with a climate champion, not somebody who will simply pursue the kind of incremental reform. This is not a time for timidity. Because that's my point on all these issues, on healthcare and climate crisis.
I said during my campaign, only big ideas will defeat big lies. Big truths will defeat big lies. You heard it here. Go to andrewromanoff.com. Now, Andrew, obviously, the country is in a crisis right now. Nobody here fails to recognize the extraordinary moment we're living in, the death of George Floyd, and how that was the spontaneous, really, eruption of the passion of the American people in response to the fact that there is now a well-established pattern of the execution of unarmed Black men by police in the United States. And not only is it that the George Floyd murder stands on top and triggers us in terms of so many deaths that have gone before him, but also there's the intersectionality issue here. People have had enough, not just in terms of police brutality, in terms of so many other levels of injustice, economic injustice, environmental injustice. When you have 1% of Americans controlling more wealth than the bottom 90%, when you have this massive transfer of wealth that has so destroyed our middle class, that has created tens of millions of people who have lived and have been living through Democratic administrations as well as Republican administrations for decades now with chronic economic anxiety. They don't know how they're going to, what will happen if they get sick or their children get sick. They don't know how they'll send their kids to college. They don't know how they'll get out from under their college loans. And then, of course, on top of this, the brutality that is evidenced in police behavior among certain people, not all policemen by any means, but enough. I was watching a hilarious and brilliantly hilarious clip last night from Chris Rock, the comedian, who said that with policemen, it's kind of like airline pilots. It's not okay to have a few bad apples. So you're in the Senate. What are you going to do? How are you going to fix it? What's your response to what's happening in America today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm horrified as you are, and as we all should be, not only by the murder of George Floyd, but by the recognition we have to face that it wasn't an isolated instance. It's part of a pattern of police brutality and part of a broader crisis of racial injustice that traces its origins to well before our country's founding. It represents America's original and persistent sin. When it comes to police brutality specifically, I think there are some steps that we should take now to ban chokeholds and other inhumane practices, to demand independent oversight and full legal accountability, to recruit and train a police force in every community that actually reflects the community it serves. We should not find ourselves at the point of having to explain why it is not acceptable to put your knee on the neck of another human being, because somebody who does that and the officers who stood by and did nothing should not be on the force in the first place. But just one more point I'd make to tether this conversation, Marianne. The truth is, America has had its knee on the neck of African Americans for centuries. African Americans brought here in chains, subjected not only to the horror of slavery, but to lynching and segregation. I mean, this is a crisis centuries in the making, and it would be bizarre if we could simply declare victory when we pass civil rights laws, recognizing that the disparities you mentioned persist to this day. I had a chance to supervise an undercover investigation of employment discrimination for a state civil rights agency, not in some distant century, but in modern times, where African-American young men posing as job applicants and paired with their white counterparts using a technique called testing were sent out into the labor market, and lo and behold, our African-American testers kept getting denied jobs in favor of their less qualified white counterparts. So we need the full weight of the federal government to protect our civil rights. I also happen to believe that we should have a national conversation about reparations in order to remedy these gaps.
First of all, statistically, even when the Black person gets the job with the same level of prior achievement, education, et cetera, even when Black people get the job, they tend to make less money, quite a bit less money than the white person. And that, of course, is on top of the fact that if a Black person and a white person are indicted for the same crime, the Black person is more likely to get about 20% longer prison term. But I want to ask you very specifically on something that you just said that you might know is a little bit of an issue for me personally, and what I myself in my own campaign and the writings that I've done. You said we should have a national conversation about reparations. Isn't it time to just say we should pay reparations?
Yes, yes, you're right. And actually, that's what I have said in the course of this campaign. Yes,
Good.
I agree.
Fine. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. And I think that, you know, while it doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, I think that those reparations have gone far towards establishing an emotional and psychological reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. And it's so interesting to me because that war was over in 1945 and our Civil War was over in 1865. And we are still dealing with the legacies. You know, it's interesting for me because as someone who is old enough to remember a lot of the changes in the 60s, I was a teenager, but I understood the significance of the Civil Rights Act. I understood the significance of the Voting Rights Act. But then when that was followed by Nixon's election and Nixon's concept of benign neglect, it was like we were on a roll and then we stopped. We were on a racial justice roll in this country. Then Nixon stopped it. And of course, in so many ways, we've actually slid backwards with mass incarceration, et cetera. So I'm glad to hear you say, because I think it's really important. We've got to go beyond a national conversation. We need to go beyond, let's have a commission. We need to go beyond, let's have a forum. I think we know what happened. And it's time, I believe, to actually put some money on the table to start a negotiation and to have reparations. Would you say that you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I would go further to recognize, as you do, the other original sin that has created disparities lasting to this day with respect to our treatment, our genocide of the Native American population. You can see
certainly. Yes, and a lot of unfairly negotiated treaties that have been broken, the Black Hills of South Dakota, the Savannah Act. Of course, I'm sure you're very aware of the missing and murdered Native women, and they are the hardest hit, correct, of all populations with COVID?
Yeah, yes, and you're right too. The percentage of Native and Indigenous women and girls who have been subjected to rape or murder and whose perpetrators have not been prosecuted is an abomination.
What about healthcare, Andrew?
Well, I support a universal single payer plan. And maybe I'll share with you, if you allow me, just a brief story about one of the reasons I do. I know it's easy to get lost in the discussion about the 28 million Americans who are uninsured, or the 44 million who are underinsured, or the 500,000 families who go bankrupt each year because they can't afford their medical bills. I spent 4 years fighting the insurance industry on behalf of a group here called Mental Health Colorado, fighting for families like mine who have been devastated by mental illness or drug addiction or suicide. And I'll just share with you one quick story. It matters, like every human life does. I met a dad whose son had deep depression, experienced a bout of psychosis, needed treatment. His insurance plan was supposed to cover it. But when the dad submitted a claim, the insurance company said no. So the dad appealed and the company said no. And the dad appealed again and the insurance company continued to deny his claims. This went on for months, until his son killed himself at the age of 14. 3 weeks later, his dad got a letter in the mail from the insurance company reversing its decision and agreeing to cover his late son's treatment. So I will tell you, Marianne, speaking not as a candidate, but just as a human being, it is deeply painful to me to have conversations with moms and dads who have lost their kids, not only to a disease we can treat, but also to the indifference of an industry that bases its profits on its ability to deny as many claims and exclude as many sick people as possible. That's the business model. And it's a great model if you're an insurance company. It's a pretty lousy model for the rest of us.
A profit-based healthcare system has simply got to become a thing of the past in the United States. And you would stand for that. Does John Hickenlooper stand for Medicare for all?
He sure does not. He actually parrots, not a great surprise, I suppose, because he, again, parrots the insurance industry's arguments against it. In fact, he goes one step further than Cory Gardner to the right. It's hard to get there. They both demonize this plan as socialism, which makes you wonder, well, what do they say about Medicare or Social Security or the rest of the public sector investments we've made?
Roosevelt was called a socialist by his opponents at the time.
Right, right. It was the same attack they used
And
against Harry
Social
Truman.
Security actually came from the Socialist Party. That's
It's just a kind of the tired demagoguery when they have nothing else to say and no real solutions. John went one step further and he described this agenda, the agenda that we share around universal single payer health coverage and climate action. He described these in his words. You can look it up on video. He said, these are the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin.
okay. Everybody, listen to me. AndrewRomanoff.com. AndrewRomanoff.com. At least $5, at least $5. Okay. This is outrageous.
Really,
Really outrageous. And of course, you have all these young people who just aren't buying that. They're looking at global capitalism the way it's practiced today, so disconnected from ethics and a sense of moral responsibility towards the earth, towards people, towards animals. And I hear these young people saying, what am I supposed to be so afraid of socialism about? The free healthcare or the free college?
well, that's it'd be comical if it weren't so dangerous, but you look at these guys who are arguing against universal single payer healthcare coverage, wondering what danger they're trying to protect us from. Is it that all of a sudden people are going to sign up for recreational heart surgery? I mean, the arguments
exactly.
are
That's a good
ridiculous.
But I think also for us to really have a conversation in our own minds, as well as a society, this is the way to stimulate your economy. The way to create an abundant economy is to help people thrive. Think how much anxiety and tension would be gone if people just knew that my healthcare is something I don't even have to worry about. This is what keeps people constricted. Think how much more energy there would be to being the employees that really are happy to be at work, the employers who aren't so nervous and upset all the time. These are the kinds of things, and that's why I feel strongly about free college. Are you for free college, state colleges and universities so people can have a higher education? Where do you stand on that?
Yes, I think we need to make that commitment to higher education available to everybody, because it's not enough just to get a high school diploma if you want the sort of job that might support a family. The point you're making is really a terrific entrepreneurial argument.
That's right.
For health reform. I've met a lot of folks who are trapped in jobs they don't want. Maybe they want to start new businesses or change jobs. I've met folks who are trapped in marriages they don't want, but fear leaving their partner because they'll lose the benefits that come with their partner's employment. I mean, this is not a system that makes any sense at all. And it strikes me too, this would be a terrific time to acknowledge that and try something else. I mean,
this is the time. This is the moment. This is not the moment to go centrist. This is the moment to claim what we really want.
FDR advocated bold, persistent experimentation. He said, above all, do something. If it doesn't work, try something else. Well, we spent 80 years trapped in this employer-based insurance model. I think it's time to acknowledge it doesn't work, especially because by some estimates, 43 million Americans may lose their employer-based coverage during this pandemic.
That's right.
And to my mind, at least, your coverage shouldn't depend on your job.
Now, also in terms of the college loans, think how many young people and not so young people went to college, took out these loans so they could follow their dreams. But now to even use that education to follow their dreams, they are now afraid that if I go for those jobs, I won't be able to pay back my college loans. So they're in jobs that are not the jobs that education trained them for, not the jobs that are following their dreams, but just the jobs that they feel they need to be in to have the healthcare coverage and to have the money that they feel they need to pay off the college loan. It is outrageous. It is a real exploitation and suppression of the dreams of the American people.
Well, and it's a huge drag, as you pointed out, on the economy. I met a lot of folks who are no longer students, but shouldering debt that now exceeds credit card and car loans and all other forms of consumer debt. So relieving them of that debt would also goose the economy. And this is a time where, by some estimates, 47 million Americans may be out of work.
Yeah.
So we ought to be looking for ways to improve employment.
It's not just young people either. It's also boomers. I've met doctors and lawyers who are loaded down by these college loans. And it all goes back to this point of why we need progressives. We need a real break with the past. We don't need what Martin Luther King called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. We need somebody to go in there. We need senators and congresspeople who say what was, and we're going a completely different direction. Okay, remember AndrewRomanoff.com. Did you have something to say before I bring in?
I've just reflected a lot on Dr. King's words, not only in the last couple of weeks, but throughout my career. And he once said, as you know, the ultimate measure of a man, he could have said a woman, is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. This is a time of challenge and controversy. And I think our measure will be taken by how we respond, whether we simply go back to business as usual or recognize that that wasn't working. You and I've talked about this before, but I mean, normal wasn't working for when the gap between rich and poor was wider than at any point since the Great Depression, when African-American families hold only 1/10 the wealth on average of white families, when 72 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured. We shouldn't simply go back. Baby steps aren't going to solve these problems.
Well, I think the point is that it's working very well for the people who are basically buying the government. It's working very well for the 1%. Who then have this undue influence on our government, which has become little more than a system of legalized bribery. And since it's unreasonable to think we're going to be able to overturn Citizens United anytime soon, given the makeup of our Supreme Court, and since we know that it's going to be a hard slog to get to the point of a constitutional amendment to establish public funding for federal campaigns, what we need to do now is what you and I are doing tonight. We need to ourselves support these candidates, show up for these candidates, and make sure that you vote. AndrewRomanoff.com. Now, we have a couple of people with questions, if that's okay with you.
Please.
Andrew, okay. There's a woman named Rosie Cruz. Rosie, would you like to come on, and we'll bring you on and you'll talk to Andrew. Hi, Rosie. Hi, how are you?
Rosie, you're muted.
We don't have sound from Rosie. Can somebody make that happen?
I'm on.
Okay, good. Hi, Rosie.
Hi.
Lay it down to Andrew.
All right. So, Andrew, I grew up outside of Oakland, California. And in 2009, I felt the Bay Area shake at the atrocity of Oscar Grant's death by the hands of policemen. And I felt the pain and agony in 2012 when Trayvon Martin died. So my question to you is this: why do you think that George Floyd's story, apart from the thousands of Blacks who have died at the hands of our police, was the breaking point in America?
First of all, I hope it is the breaking point. I hope it actually prompts action. To Marianne's point earlier, not just a national conversation, even that's the predicate to action. I'd offer you a few thoughts. One, this was a murder we could see on video in unmistakable terms. And while I'm glad the officer is being prosecuted for murder, it seems to me responsibility also lies with his colleagues who stood by and did nothing. But I think it is undeniable to the naked eye what happened there as a man gasped for his life and begged to his murder. I think that accounts for, to some extent, for the fact that this is galvanizing the country in a way that those previous horrific crimes did not. Second, I'd say it's a credit to the protesters, both the folks in the Black Lives Matter cause and others around the country who have suggested they're not simply going to stand by themselves and do nothing while this takes place. And the third explanation, and I'm speculating here, of course, is that in other times, you might expect an American president at least to make the right noises in order to comfort the nation. At this time, you've got a president who has done the opposite, who has incited violence using not just a dog whistle, but a bullhorn to embolden extremists, to fan the flames of racism and hatred. A president who has threatened a military crackdown, a president who himself ordered the gassing of protesters at the White House so that he could stage a photo op. And just one last point I'll make real quick, not just with respect to this horror, but every other abuse this administration has inflicted. The reason that Donald Trump has been able to inflict so much damage on our country is in part because he finds allies at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. There were several Republican senators interviewed after the president's response, this incendiary conduct where he's pouring gasoline on this national fire. And they were asked for a word of dissent. They couldn't offer any. The invertebrate members of the Republican Senate caucus, instead, one said, it's not helpful. Another said, it's not constructive. My opponent, my Republican opponent, Cory Gardner, said, well, we all have to do better every day. That is not enough. I mean, it enables Trump to continue, and God forbid he wins a second term, he will be completely unbound.
I couldn't agree more. And I saw the senators, the Republican senators who were walking into session, and the reporter was asking, do you think it's all right that the president used tear gas to disperse a crowd so that he could go over to the church for a photo op? I had been there, by the way, an hour before. And I assure you that was a peaceful crowd. And people say, somebody said, no, they were looting. There aren't even any stores around there to loot. I mean, it's ridiculous. But to your point, every senator, except for Lisa Murkowski, who did say, to her credit, this is not the America that I know. I think that we're living at a time, and I hope that you and so many young people, Rosie, are noticing this. We're seeing the worst of America in all of this, but also we're seeing the best of America.
Right.
The people protesting are example of the best of America, the peaceful protesters, obviously, and the vast, vast majority of them are. Also, we have seen things such as Mike Mullen today, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said, I can remain silent no longer. Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense, who had the courage to stand up even though Trump is upset with him, and to say that we will not be using, I see no reason for the Insurrection Act. I see no reason to be using military against our own citizens. When you have people like the woman who is the Episcopalian bishop who decried the president using her church for a photo op, much less dispersing crowds with rubber bullets and tear gas to make his way there. The next day, the Catholic bishop, who spoke up about a similar photo op at a Catholic church. So I think, this is how I feel, particularly for you, Rosie, that I hope that there is hope in your heart based on the fact that as much as we are seeing the ugly underbelly of American society, so many people your age, and I hope you feel people in many, many ages and demographics are showing up, for that matter, including Republicans. A lot of Republicans right now are saying, this is it, this is just not what our party is supposed to stand for either. Don't you agree with that? Yes.
I do agree with that, yes.
I wanted to just offer one thought and ask Rosie a question. I don't mean to put you on the spot for asking such a good question of your own. The observation I'll make just briefly is that while this is a moment where America needs to say the emperor has no clothes, we also ought to recognize, of course, that Donald Trump didn't invent bigotry. He certainly weaponized it and legitimized it, but replacing him doesn't end this problem. It'd be easier if it did. The question I was going to ask Rosie is the same question you're asking me, actually. Do you have a sense of why this moment, among all the other horrific crimes that have preceded it and all the other African Americans who have lost their lives, including those victims of police brutality, why this, to your point, might be the breaking point?
You know, I've thought about this, and I think you're spot on when you're talking about how social media was able to capture this. I mean, there's an 8-minute long video of this happening, of a brutal choking. And I think compared to the other stories, we don't have as much information on them. And so I think you're spot on when you said that this was revolutionized because we saw 8 minutes of footage. And you can tell that the protesters, I went to the protest in Denver, and you know, that's the heart of the protest. You know, we kneeled for that amount of time that George Floyd was choked. And it was powerful.
It's a credit to you and to the protesters. We had several forums now on racial justice, and I wanted to make the case, as I did then, that it's not enough for us to say Black Lives Matter,
right,
although they do, when every single day we act as if they don't.
You know, it's interesting about social media, because I agree with obviously what Rosie said about the fact that, you know, and as has been said by many people, for as many of these as we've seen on camera, imagine how many happened that we did not see.
Exactly.
And there is the social media coverage, not only of the things that you were talking about in Denver, but of peaceful protests all over. But unfortunately, social media is also responsible for the platforms that have been created over the last few years for the homophobes and the racists and the bigots and the anti-Semites and so many that no intelligent observer ever thought did not exist anymore in America. But I grew up at a time, and in my early adulthood, we did think we had reached a point, a consensus, a general social consensus on both left and right, that the far out bigots, racists, anti-Semites, et cetera, would not be given by either Republicans or Democrats a major political megaphone. now we have a president who gives them a wink and a wink, but good people on both sides every day of his administration. Plus we have this power of these platforms, which of course is something for Mark Zuckerberg to have to deal with, and Jack Dorsey at Twitter. As long as we're at that, what do you think about the tech companies, Andrew? What would you do about that?
Yeah, I'll offer you a couple thoughts. I was going to say, and I'll get Rosie's thoughts here too, because you're, I assume, a social media user. I'm just figuring all this stuff out. I'm not quite ready for TikTok. Just to the earlier point Marianne made.
Get there, because it's quite a scene.
I know. My staff
learn to dance and learn to dance now.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quote not Mark Zuckerberg, but Mark Twain, who once said, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still tying its shoes." And when he said that, obviously well before the advent of the internet and before the arrival of a president who has done such an effective job, if you can call it that, of delegitimizing the news media, telling folks not to believe anything other than what comes out of his own mouth. And that's really made it hard, I will tell you, to win any arguments. I would get in trouble here for referencing my dad, who voted for President Trump and intends to do so again. It wasn't like I was sorry, I shocked Marianne there. I wasn't winning a lot of arguments with my dad to begin with.
I was
like, there's no hope. There's no hope at all, because I love my dad, but there's no hope for winning these arguments, because you can no longer appeal to a common set of facts when those are in dispute from a president who compares the news media, calls them the enemy of the people. And that's also, by the way, a point of inciting violence. It's surprising to me that we haven't seen more acts of violence. Any would be too many against journalists. When it comes to the tech companies, look, I think we ought to be willing to use our antitrust laws.
Thank you. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Rosie. I really
Thanks, Rosie.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This is really a great opportunity for you to talk to the youth of America. Obviously, it goes without saying. And the next questioner is also one of the youth of America. His name is Jacob Scher, or Scher. I'm not sure which. Jacob, you can correct me. Is Jacob here? Hello. Hey, Jacob. Hi. How are you?
Hi. It's Scher. You're right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
You're so welcome.
Andrew, I wanted to ask you, and this is something that you touched on briefly earlier, given all the social unrest and all the tragic events that are happening in our country now, what do you think is the single most important thing that the next administration and the next president should do to start to heal the country?
It's a powerful question. I'm mindful of the advice that Marianne shared earlier, that this is not a time simply for conversation, but as Elvis said, a little more action, please. Obviously there will be a collective sigh of relief, I suspect, when Donald Trump leaves the White House, I hope voluntarily. But it's not enough for us to simply declare victory then. So I think the next president and the next, I hope, Democratic majority in the Senate, and the progressives like me who hope to help lead it, are going to have a lot of damage control first. But better yet, to my mind, at least to seize this moment to inspire people to reimagine the way in which we have operated everything. I know you're asking for a single issue, and I disagree with Senator Gardner on the climate crisis, on healthcare reform, on gun violence prevention, and on so many other issues. I look at this as an opportunity, you might call it a New Deal moment for America, where we recognize that what we were doing wasn't working, except, as Marianne said, for those at the top who were bankrolling or bribing the members of Congress. I don't think that's an overstatement at all. And instead say, look, we deserve an economy that works for everyone, but that requires a government that works for everyone. So if I had to pick among all these issues, the climate crisis, the healthcare crisis, I'd say one theme, at least, that emerges is the way in which we finance our campaigns. I mean, there's a reason the nation's biggest corporations are bankrolling both parties. It's not the goodness of their hearts. After all, they don't technically have hearts. They're despite what the Supreme Court may tell you, corporations are not actually people. It's because they get something in return. And I wish I could tell you, since I'm a Democrat and running for the Democratic nomination, that my party, our party, was free of this influence, but we're not. And it seems to me we've got to be willing to stand up to our own party when our conscience or our constituents demand it. I'd suggest I'm doing that right now by running, despite the clear wishes of the national political establishment.
And I hope that everybody was listening, and everybody who feels an alignment with Andrew, I hope that you will go to andrewromanoff.com and give whatever you feel moved to give no matter how much it is, because every little bit helps.
Can I take you, Marianne, on every town hall just to make this
Yeah.
beautiful pitch that you're making?
It's easier to raise money for other people. I was, yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so listen. So on this business about money, I wanted to mention last year alone, big pharmaceutical companies lobbied Congress to the tune of $284 million. And even oil and gas was only 125 million. So when big pharmaceutical companies, oil and gas, et cetera, give money to candidates, there's a quid pro quo there. They're not doing it for charitable purposes. And that's what we have to realize. Until we get, to me, the money in politics, the undue influence of money, particularly corporate money in politics, is the cancer that underlies all the other cancers. I don't know what happened to Jacob. I thought, did he not like us? I don't know why they took Jacob away. Jacob, where'd you go? I don't know why they took Jacob away, but anyway, I hope, Jacob, did you?
He came back.
Andrew answered your question. Did you have anything else you wanted to ask him?
Yes, he did. That was a great answer too.
Great. Andrew, I have a question for you. What about the college loan debts? We have tens of millions of Americans. We have $1.5 trillion in college loan debt. What do you think? You know, you're talking about bold progressive change. What are you going to do about the college loan debt?
I think we should relieve it. And I'll tell you, in turn, we will see more revenue come to the economy than it's costing us, because this burden that I was going to say students, but as you pointed out, adults who were students at one point and are carrying these loans, the burden they face is really a drag on the economy, on their ability ever to climb out from under this mountain of debt. And it's an issue, by the way, that transcends the federal government. We haven't talked much about the state's role here, but I, as I mentioned, led the House of Representatives. I teamed up with a friend of mine. I'll give a plug to Carrie Kennedy, who is our state treasurer. She and I and a group of advocates passed the largest investment in school construction in state history. I'll just tell you one story here because I think it's relevant. We visited schools all across Colorado where the roofs were caving in or the floorboards were too rotten to hold up a desk. I used to teach in Central America, so I'd seen conditions like these in some extent, but not in Central Colorado. And we visited kids who were embarrassed when a group of legislators was touring their school, especially embarrassed when another team would come from a more affluent school and laugh at the conditions where they were studying. I remember in particular a conversation I had with a young woman we met in the San Luis Valley. And if you haven't been there, Marianne, it's one of the most beautiful parts of our state and also one of the poorest. And the girl we met at a school in the valley put a question to Carrie Kennedy, who was the state treasurer at the time, and to me as the Speaker of the House. She said, well, how come you don't care as much about me and kids like me as you do about kids back in Denver or Cherry Creek or wherever you're from? I thought, well, you deserve a better answer to that question. The quality of your education shouldn't depend on your zip code or your parents' bank account. So Carrie and I marched back to the state capitol, put together a coalition of lawmakers, passed a plan we call BEST, it stands for Building Excellent Schools Today. And today there are 525 school projects that have sprung up in some of the most low-income communities in rural Colorado and other parts of the state, not because the young woman we met in the San Luis Valley had made a contribution to our campaign. She didn't offer, we didn't ask. Not because she had formed a political action committee. She shouldn't have to. We ought to be willing, this is more important to me than anything else I think I'll say tonight, we ought to be willing to value every single person, not because of their net worth, but just because of their basic worth as human beings. And that above all is the principle we've lost.
And by the way, children are full-blown American children. And if our promise in our Declaration of Independence is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we have 13 million American children who go to school hungry. Where's their capacity to pursue happiness? We have millions of American children who go to school in classrooms such as you described that don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished. The chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Where is their right to pursue happiness? So what we're talking about here is the immorality, I believe, basic immorality of the fact that we primarily base our educational funding, our public school funding, on property taxes. And if this country were to say that every school in America, this is what I believe, every school in America, every public school in America, like you said, no matter what zip code, should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. Once again, this is how to have your economy that thrives. Help people spread their wings. Help people manifest their dreams. Help people actualize their dreams. That's how they will create abundance. It is the money comes from the productivity and the creativity of the American people, not from crumbs that drop from the table of the corporate elite. We need to completely shift from an economic to a humanitarian bottom line. And that's why people such as Jacob and Rosie, who are young, you know, the thing, Jacob, I feel you should have free healthcare. I feel you should have free higher education. I feel you should have all of these things, not so that you can be a slacker, but because your society is building a social contract with you, that we want you to take all those burdens off the table so that you can become the man that you are capable of being, the creative person you are capable of being, whatever your dreams are. What is it that you want to do in your life, Jacob? What do you want to be? What do you want to do?
I'm still not entirely sure, but
How old are you, Jacob?
I'm 18.
Oh, that's great. Well, you have a long time to decide, but I will tell you this. I believe, and I think Andrew believes, that our society should invest in your ability to manifest whatever the dreams are that you have, whatever the creativity, whatever the productivity, not just so that your life will be better, but so that America will be better. And that's, to me, the progressive vision. Wouldn't you agree with that, Andrew?
I do. I'm putting a lot of pressure on Jacob here because
I know, but that's okay. It's never too young. He's going to vote this year. He's an adult. Yeah. You know, I think part of the problem that we've had in America is a prolonged adolescence. I think that's changing with COVID, and it's changing with this crisis right now. But we have too many people in America who have allowed themselves to be infantilized by modern culture. Too many women going around like little girls and too many men going around like little boys. And I think that's changing now. And, you know, if we can put a gun in Jacob's hand, if God forbid we needed him to go to war, and if we can tell him you're old enough now that you have the right to vote, then he's also old enough to take full responsibility for where the country goes from here. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So Andrew Romanoff, I believe that people in the summit tonight got a real sense of what you stand for. I want to hear anything from you that you might still want to say, that you want people to know. My hope with the Progressive Candidate Summit, for all of you who have been watching, my hope is that you're getting to know these candidates. You're getting to know them as people. You're getting to understand that these candidates not only are standing for something so important, but also to know that it is a co-creative effort between them and the rest of us to make sure that they get into Congress. Congress is a co-equal branch of government. This is not just about the presidential race. These down ballot races, Congress and Senate, are every bit as important. And once again, as we, I think, made very clear here tonight, there are Democrats and there are Democrats. So supporting the progressive Andrew Romanoff in this case is extremely important. Anything else you want to say, Andrew?
Just a couple quick points, and thanks for indulging me here. You're right that Congress is supposed to be a co-equal branch. I used to teach American government, and I feel like I need to go regrade my students' papers because the ones who couldn't identify 3 independent branches should be forgiven. I mean, the Senate is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of the White House right now and surrendered its authority to this rogue president. The other point I'll share with you, Marianne, and thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate this. When you were discussing just now with Jacob, the investment we make in him and the opportunity for him to fulfill his potential, it's a profoundly important point, not just for our country, but for the world. You mentioned when you introduced me the work I did in Central America. Yeah. After I left college, I moved to Nicaragua in the wake of a very brutal civil war that our government helped finance. I was teaching English in a little village, a fishing village on the coast of Nicaragua. And one day I gave my students an assignment. I said, tell me what you want to do when you grow up. The same kind of question you just asked Jacob. And one of my students began his essay by telling me what he wanted to do if he grew up. Not when, but if. Because growing up in Nicaragua at the time was not a guarantee. This was a kid with just as much hope and talent and potential as anyone anywhere in the world, but a child who might not have a chance to fulfill his potential, not because of some faults of his own, but just because of the luck of the draw. You asked me earlier what inspired my interest in public service, and I think it was that conversation with that young man at that time that really shaped my views. Because to me, at least, our obligation as a society is to make it possible for all of us to thrive, to use your words. And that opportunity is being denied to too many children here in the richest nation on the face of the earth, and obviously too many other kids around the world. I'm hoping I can make a difference.
That is very heartbreaking, that story. And also, especially today, we should remember that there are young people in neighborhoods in this country who have the same view, if I survive, who are growing up in what's called America's domestic war zones. Psychologists say that there are young people in America. It is said that this is true of 40% of the girls in the public schools of Chicago, who would be clinically diagnosed with a PTSD that is every bit as severe as a returning veteran from Afghanistan and Iraq, which is why when I was running, I felt strongly about a Department of Children and Youth. It all happens in these first 8 years. I know that you've talked about that with these kids, and it is horrifying for us as Americans. We hear a story like that of a child in Nicaragua, if I grow up. And I think what many of us are taking in a whole new way right now is how many children in America would say the same thing. I wish you the very, very best, Andrew. I think you're great. I will continue to talk you up. And I hope that those of you who have been watching tonight are understanding the importance of our showing up for people such as Andrew, all of these progressive candidates. Tomorrow night, there will be a change in our itinerary, as it were, in our schedule. Tomorrow night, we will have Hector Osagura from New Jersey's District 8. And on Friday night, I know a lot of you are excited to meet Shahid Buttar, San Francisco, who will be running against Nancy Pelosi in that primary. Saturday night, a very exciting candidate named Robin Wilt in New York. On Sunday, Shan Chowdhury, also running for Congress from New York. On Monday night, Jen Perelman, who is running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida. And we've added a night because of a candidate that I'm very excited about, a woman named Keita Haynes, who is running in Tennessee, in Nashville, District 5. These are all wonderful people. And you've met Andrew tonight, you've met JD last night. You can also see at the Progressive Candidate Summit, as well as MarianneWilliamson.com, my entire list of endorsees. There are so many great people running, and especially now, don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. We've got a lot of work to do. Not everything has gone the way we would have wished, but other generations have stood up and made things better, and so will we. Andrew, you have any final word?
Ballots go out on Monday. Our campaign has a primary on June 30th, but it's a universal mail-in election. So voting starts next week. If folks want to go to andrewromanoff.com to learn more, help us keep advertising. We just started today with a conversation around healthcare on our first ad. And mostly, I just want to say thank you. I really, really appreciate the fact that you're willing to share time with me and with the other folks who are running for office. It's been hard to break through all the news of the day, but the decision we're making, especially in this race, will decide not just the next administration, but over the next 6 years, what kind of progressive leadership we want in the United States Senate.
I acknowledge you for running. I acknowledge you for going through what you have to go through. And I hope with all my heart that you get some support from being with us tonight. Much love, everybody. Thank you. God bless you, Andrew. And to all of you, stay safe. Take care. Much love. I'll see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.